Questions have also been raised about the second expert witness of prosecution, Dr Sandy Bohin. 8 families are currently filing formal complaints against her over their children's care.
To have our intentions and actions questioned was a sinister and sickening abuse of power which should have never been allowed to happen.
That was firstly David Davis speaking in a parliamentary adjournment debate about the role of expert witnesses, and secondly a representative for families involved in something known as the Guernsey safeguarding scandal, an ongoing investigation into child protection in the bailiwick of Guernsey. So you might have guessed at this point that Dr Sandy Bohin was an expert witness in the 2022 to 2023 trial of Lucy Letby. She was the second most prolific witness in the trial. Only the notorious Dr Dowie Evans featured more often in the trial. In contrast to Dr Evans, who seems to have been on a media tour trying to shore up the safety of the Lucy Letby conviction, Dr Bohin has been much more circumspect in her engagements with the media. Despite being reluctant to comment on her trial evidence outside the court process, there is nevertheless significant evidence of contradiction, in my opinion, between the things she told the jury and the statements she has made to the media. Outside of giving evidence in the Lucy Letby trial, something she shares with Dr Evans is a very controversial background in child protection. David Davis mentioned in the parliamentary adjournment debate that at that time there were 8 families with complaints about Dr Bohin being investigated.
Questions have also been raised about the second expert witness of prosecution, Dr Sandy Bohin. 8 families are currently filing formal complaints against her over their children's care.
A little known fact about Dr Bohin is that this was not the first time she had been named in a parliament of sorts. She was previously named by a Guernsey Member of Parliament, Deputy Gavin St. Pier.
She was told that Dr Bohin had weaponised the safeguarding service.
So I think it's pretty clear that Dr Bohin has a controversial reputation. In fact, comparing her to the notorious Dr Evans, whose past has been coming back to haunt him recently to an extent, Dr Bohin is arguably, in fact, the more controversial of the 2 expert witnesses. Not that it's a competition. So first, to look at the background and circumstances which led to Dr Bohin being named in Parliament in Guernsey, and then to look at some of the differences of opinion we can infer from the evidence Dr Bohin gave in court compared to other medical experts who have seen the full notes. I say differences of opinion, considering the amount of controversy surrounding Dr Bohin. There may be a question mark over her competence. There is also reason to be sceptical that she always tells the truth. There is a Guernsey radio station, which I will leave a link to in the description, which is a good source of information if you want to get your head around the allegations against Dr Bohin.
Deputy St Pier did more recently make further accusations against Dr Bohin relating to his daughter's care.
The public controversy with Dr Bohin seems to have started sometime around 2014. Deputy Gavin St Pier, a Guernsey Member of Parliament, would take his daughter to the doctor looking for treatment. The details are vague, but during the process of making a diagnosis, there would be some difficulties. The accusations are that either there would be problems obtaining an accurate diagnosis and a second opinion would be blocked, or that immediately there would be questions raised over Deputy St Pierre's parenting.
In terms of my own family's experience, it regarded the matter as a one-off aberration, and the matter had been closed in 2016. And
it's not clear if Dr Bohin was necessarily the treating doctor in this case, or if she became involved as part of the safeguarding process. The accusations, as I understand them, are that she is generally inclined to side with the doctors when they take a position against the parents. After initially thinking he was the only one, several years later, Deputy Gavin St Pier would find out that wasn't the case.
It was only when I was approached by the 3 other families in 2021 did I realise that in fact it wasn't a one-off.
At the time of David Davis' speech in Parliament, there were 8 families with active complaints against Dr Bohin.
8 families are currently filing formal complaints against her over their children's care.
Whilst 8 may be the number of active complaints, the Guernsey radio station, which I am referencing, would say they were aware of 17 families with complaints.
Since speaking to Deputy St Pier, a total of 17 people have come forward.
The issue would become politicised in Guernsey Parliament, with Deputy Peter Furbash forming opposition to Gavin St Pier, though I don't think he would meet any families with specific grievances. Deputy Tina Burry, on the other hand, would meet with them.
As one of the very few people in this chamber who has actually sat in a room with the families at the heart of this,
Deputy Tina Burry would be struck when meeting the families with how palpably upset that they were.
the families sat around that table, some of whom were visibly traumatised.
To give you an idea of the agencies to which the families who say they were earnestly seeking treatment were referred, I'll read through this passage on the Guernsey safeguarding scandal from an article linked in the description. The families say challenging the healthcare professionals led to them being put through safeguarding processes with agencies including CAMHS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, the police, Children's Social Care, and the school attendance services getting involved. When Dr Bohin would escape sanctioning by the General Medical Council and in fact instead fight back and portray herself as the victim, this would provoke outrage amongst the families. This is from the clip on the Guernsey radio station which I played at the start of the video and is also quoted in the media.
As the parents of seriously ill children, instead of being supported in our quest to find solutions and treatment,
we were blocked from seeking second opinions and private consultations. Not only were we blocked, we were persecuted by being put through traumatic and needless investigations, questioning our ability to care for our own children. As any parent can imagine, purely the act of caring for a sick child is exhausting, worrying, and traumatizing.
to have our intentions and actions questioned was a sinister and sickening abuse of power which should have never been allowed to happen.
So now to look at some general criticism which Dr Bohin's testimony at the trial has provoked. The original expert witness for the defence, Dr Mike Hall, has criticised the prosecution witnesses' portrayal of the health status of some of the babies.
Phrases such as "the baby was really, really well" were given by the prosecution expert witnesses on several occasions for several of the babies.
The case of baby I, or baby 9, is perhaps the most objective example of this. The bacteria Stenotrophomonas Maltophilia was found in the endotracheal tube, yet this wasn't acknowledged by Dr Bohin or the hospital doctors. According to Dr Shuli's expert panel, the baby's reaction after the bacteria was found in the tube was stereotypical for a neonate infected by this bacteria, even if I'm not sure the baby necessarily tested positive directly.
The surveillance culture revealed a bacteria called Stenotrophomonas Maltophilia. Doctors in the unit were duly notified.
They weren't really, really well. They had signs of significant illness.
Another case where Dr Lee and Dr Hall seem to be in agreement is the case of baby D or baby 4.
This was not a stable baby, as alleged by the prosecution witness.
Dr Roger Norwich is another former consultant paediatrician who has publicly suggested Dr Bohin was less than honest during her trial testimony.
Testimonies given by Drs Bohin and Dr Evans in court were absolutely astounded by some of the responses.
The next article, which is related to the questions over Dr Bohin brought up by Drs Hall, Norwich and Lee, is this one in the Telegraph. Medical experts struck by witnesses' lack of expertise at Letby trial. Most of the experts quoted speak in technical terms, or denigrate the expertise of prosecution experts Drs Evans and Bohin. Of note, I think, are the comments of Professor Michael Norman, founder of the International Society of Evidence-Based Neonatology, who said, quote, "I had very little knowledge about the Letby case before this, and I reviewed 2 cases. In one case of attempted murder, the statements of the trial experts were inconsistent, incorrect, and biased." I single out the quote from Professor Michael Norman because he raises the issue of potential bias. I don't think I'm in a position to say if the issue is one of character or competence, but I think it's worth keeping an open mind. Some of Dr. Bohin's CV can be found online, and on paper she does seem to have very impressive credentials. Dr. Mike McConville is a retired GP who I think had a lengthy stint in paediatrics at the start of his career. He has a podcast called The Other Side of Lucy Letby, which I recommend for those wanting to take a deeper dive into the medical science of the case. He has used the following analogy when describing Dr. Bohin's performance at the trial.
If the best goalkeeper in the world saves 20 shots in a match, but lets in 1, you would still say he was the best goalkeeper in the world.
In other words, I think everyone can make a mistake from time to time, even a shocking mistake. However, in the case of Dr. Bohin, there are suggestions the mistakes are routinely quite shocking.
But if the same goalkeeper 20 times in a row turned around and kicked the ball into his own net, you would begin to question your judgment.
So next, to look at some eyebrow-raising statements and perhaps contradictions from Dr. Bohin. Firstly, this is how she characterised the air embolism theory on the BBC Panorama show.
So having crossed off all the likely things, you then have to look at unlikely and rare and unthinkable things like air embolus.
So now let's look at what Dr. Bohin told the court on day 15 of the trial, 25th of October 2022. Prosecutor Nick Johnson puts it to her, "What, in your opinion, killed baby A?" Dr. Bohin categorically responds, "I think baby A was killed by an air embolus." So you have to wonder how, on the one hand, Dr. Bohin can tell Panorama that air embolus is rare and unthinkable, and then make a categoric air embolus diagnosis in the courtroom.
You then have to look at unlikely and rare and unthinkable things like air embolus.
Personally, I wonder if she's phrasing it in this way on Panorama because she knows this is going out to a wider audience and may be seen by other doctors. Therefore, she is phrasing it in a way that would be more acceptable to other doctors, keeping her fingers crossed no one will look too closely at how categoric she was in the courtroom. This exchange between Lucy Letby defence lawyer Ben Myers and Dr. Bohin on day 28 of the trial underlines how important Dr. Xu Li's research was in the air embolism diagnosis. Ben Myers, quote, "And the only description you point to in the literature, which you have raised just then, is that one description we've seen in the Lee and Tanswell, isn't it?" Dr. Bohin responds, "Yes." Referring back to the case of baby A, which was discussed on day 15, this exchange, I think, shows some bizarre statements from Dr. Bohin. Ben Myers puts it to her, quote, "Your evidence, just so I can confirm this is correct, is that before the time of the collapse, baby A was extremely stable and not escalating in any problem. That is your evidence, yes." Dr. Bohin responds, "Yes." Ben Myers then asks the obvious question, "Could you just help us with the difference between stable and extremely stable?" This isn't necessarily immediately outrageous, because Dr. Xu Li's panel described baby A as stable before collapse. However, the use of the phrase extremely stable doesn't exactly sound like the most technical way of putting it. Furthermore, there are indicators baby A was not perfectly okay. It was acknowledged that the baby had elevated lactate, and an elevated respiratory rate, as well as being on breathing support. Questions have also been asked about the evidence Dr. Bohin gave in regards to baby D. This is what Dr. Bohin had to say when Nick Johnson suggested there was a sudden unexpected collapse. Dr. Bohin responds, quote, "The thing that was striking about the collapses were that they were, all three of them were sudden and unexpected because, as I've just stated, baby D, certainly prior to the first collapse, was stable, and even after the first collapse she recovered very well. So these were collapses that came out of the blue. They weren't expected. There was nothing leading up to them that would make people concerned. The collapses were sudden." This, in contrast, is some of what Dr. Xu Li had to say about the health status of baby D prior to the collapse.
And in this case, the coagulation time was increased. Now, this is a serious development because it indicates that the infection is going out of control.
I'm not going to go through all of Dr. Bohin's controversial statements at the trial here. A further case where she made controversial statements was in that of baby G. Dr. Bohin's testimony was that a C-reactive protein level greater than 200 milligrams per litre, measured in a blood test taken several hours after a period of vomiting, was not a solid indicator that the period of vomiting could be explained by infection. So in conclusion, Dr. Bohin is a doctor with a controversial reputation, and the testimony she gave at the Lucy Letby trial is consistent with that. I don't think I'm in a position to say if the issue is one of bad character or incompetence. It may be the case that she has other issues that distract her from doing a diligent or competent job. I expect the contribution of Dr. Bohin will be the subject of increasing focus in the coming months or years.